Thanks very much indeed for coming to this. This is the rise and fall of the Ivory Tower session, where we have a great panel. My name is Austin Williams. I run the Future Cities Project. I'll be doing some other sessions in the course of the day and tomorrow. But this is going to be a conversation rather necessarily than a panel debate. We haven't prepared any introductory remarks. We'll just have a bit of a chat, hopefully engage you in that conversation as we go along. Okay, so a brief backdrop is the fact that the president of the Universities UK, which is kind of the advocacy organisation for universities represented by vice-chancellors, said that universities face a choice. We can have universities that can deliver on the new government's missions, or we can let them slide into decline. And you kind of think, if that's the choice, then that's one of the reasons why we didn't call this session What Are Universities For? Because we've slipped slightly further down the hellhole around that, and now this is kind of, do universities deserve to survive? That's the way, my framing, maybe not yours, but effectively the Daily Telegraph just had an opinion piece last week which started saying, quote, "The collapse of our university is one of the best things that could happen to Britain." Okay, now that's a little bit extreme, and obviously there are jobs at stake, there are livelihoods, and in some instances there's education at stake in some universities. But the University College Union, which is the lecturers' union, says that there's 64 universities are rolling out redundancy packages. Departments are closing, sometimes at a very moment's notice. And meanwhile, vice-chancellors' salaries go up to £325,000. Thanks very much, on average. The university sector's survival strategy very often fails to mention education. If you kind of read a lot of the universities out there, they kind of are more concerned with the organisation, the process and the structure than they are about actually what's actually happening to students, even though they talk about students as being, their charges. My own I teach at Kingston School of Art, so maybe I shouldn't tell you this, but I have started now, so I'll finish. My own Vice-Chancellor announced it is no longer simply enough for universities to offer narrow subject-based knowledge to students. We have to equip them with future skills training for an increasingly technological and digital world. So a world that we don't even know exists yet, but we have to at least train them somehow that they can cope when they get a job. So it's basically education for a job. Maybe you agree with that. Maybe you think that's the best way to go, but we can have a conversation. So the questions on the table, I think, are: should universities reinvent themselves? Can they reinvent themselves? Should they reinvent themselves? Should universities be allowed to collapse under the weight of their own bureaucracy? Or perhaps we can maybe start to think about what we should do instead. Is there a new model that we can start to kind of inquire upon? So we got a very good panel of conversationalists. We'll start with, in the middle here, we have Maeve Halligan. She's studying Russian and French at Bristol University. She's also an acclaimed musician, and you'll see her tonight. But for the purposes of this conversation, she's a student representative for Academic Freedom, AFAF, a tremendous organisation for free speech within the university sector. We also have Jenny Bristow on my immediate left, is reader in sociology at Canterbury Christchurch University. She's also the author of Generational Encounters with Higher Education.
Academic student relations.
Yeah, we haven't got time for a subtitle. Typical academics. That's always like the key issues in the subtitle. The front title is just sexy. Anyway, it's about academic education in relation to the university sector. She's written many, many books, so this is just the latest hot off the presses. And then, not finally, but on the far left, if you excuse the expression, we have Professor Neil Finn, who has had his own battles with academia over recent years. I'm sure you know. He's Honorary Research Fellow at the University of Edinburgh and on the advisory board of the Free Speech Union, another tremendous organisation. They do have a stall upstairs if you're interested. And there you go. So that's what we have here. I wanted to start talking about identifying some of the problems, because there may be some people here who don't fully get what the hell we're talking about. You know, here we are, middle-class arseholes, talking about the problems we have in universities, right? Oh, la-di-da, right? So what are the problems? Are there the problems? And maybe whether you have some examples you can share with us. Who wants to kick off? Silence all round. Right, no, go, Neil, go.
I'll go. So at a very general level, the really biggest problem is just the sheer rapidity of changes in universities over the past 50 years or so in this country, but also worldwide. And we can start shopping lists of the changes we think that matter most. I worked in the same university for 36 years as a lecturer, and when I started, the class sizes were tiny, and when I finished, my smallest class was 120, my biggest was 450. We internationalized incredibly rapidly. We increased student numbers. We diversified our student base very rapidly. Mostly things that were really, really welcomed. But throughout all those periods, that period of incredibly rapid change, the university estate didn't change very much. The basic methods of doing things didn't change that much. We had the internet, and then we had the web in the early years of my career. I mean, totally life-changing stuff. And then, recently we've had bureaucratization, incredibly rapid marketization. So at the very least, even if I do happen to think that universities in general are wonderful institutions. I love them to bits, and I love my home university to bits, even though I left in a bit of a bad state a couple of years ago, but I still love it to bits.
Never bad bridges.
But I do think that, they always have to keep reinventing themselves. They always have to keep rethinking. And particularly post-COVID, I thought, this is a time when universities really are going to radically rethink, and that everything they've done, it really started yet. But I do think there's a lot of serious reinvention needs to be.
All right, okay. But you're putting a bit of a positive spin on that, I guess.
So I'm saying the pace of change is the big problem, but within that, there are more specific changes we might want to unpack. But also, we shouldn't. So this I speak as a happiness lecturer. We shouldn't stop thinking aspirationally about them. If you compare universities to other kinds of major institutions, universities have always tried to be aspirational from the get-go. They tried to be a place for communities of scholars to think different, to do things differently in really aspirational ways. Schooling, by contrast, which I think now is in some ways more aspirational than it was. As far as I understand it, the history of schooling is it was mainly invented to keep kids out of trouble, so it was remedial. But, schooling was invented as a remedial solution to a problem. And other big institutions, health services, of course, respond to illnesses, military respond to military threats. But universities are fundamentally and have to be aspirational before they start being problem-oriented.
Very good, very good. Okay, so you're the happiness representative. I'm the miserable one. So we'll pitch it in the middle. Who wants to have a go? Because, again, you might want to... There's 50 years of history, as Neil's put forward, but pandemic and post-pandemic are obviously kind of fairly crucial moments in educational history. So, Maeve, give it a go.
Thank you very much for having me, first of all, and I'm really happy to be speaking. I'm basically, on this panel, I'm sort of thinking to represent what I'm finding is going on in universities now. So I'm a student at the University of Bristol. As I said, I do study French and Russian, which is kind of a strange course because studying a language at degree level it's a very obvious combination of the gaining of a practical skill, which a language is. It's one of the few subjects in school where every single thing that you hear or use in the classroom you could hypothetically go out into the street and use. It's very different from other things that way. It's kind of a lot more tangible, in my opinion, and it's why it's a shame that in lower level education languages are underfunded and not especially championed. But regardless, at university, yes, you've got the practical skill element of language, but you've also got, it's a really diverse degree. I'll be in lectures all the time with students of politics, liberal arts, literature, all of that kind of thing. It's very, very multifaceted. The University of Bristol specifically is definitely one that when we think woke with a capital W, it's up there. It's probably Bristol, Brighton, a bit of Leeds, Manchester, these places and institutions that do claim to want to, in my opinion, protect their students before they educate them. And unfortunately, one of the key elements of being educated is being challenged. Just as a part of my personal experience, I speak Russian because I lived there as a child and I went to a fully Russian school. And good Lord, it was not easy initially. I had no, way of communicating, but it was such an important element of my educational experience because it was so challenging. And unfortunately, it was a big decision for me to go to university at all, let alone in the United Kingdom. And when I did, I expected myself to be far more challenged than that. And I'm telling you, I haven't been. And it's really unfortunate because it's such a key part of your life, sort of cerebrally, neurologically speaking. You're so up for grabs. But in terms of the way that your brain can be shaped and challenged and molded But I would say that these days, and I see this in Bristol and I see this in, my friends, I would say, at other universities, we used to be a demographic that were up for grabs and that were up for adaptation, but now we're just up for capture. And I see these students all the time. A big part of student life is protest, and I can respect that. It's a time in your life when, your responsibilities are pretty much solely to yourself, and as a result, you can choose where to put your attentions. It's a huge privilege in that sense, to use a very overused word. But, I see peers holding placards and shouting about things they've never had to truly defend. At universities, it's a massive shame that, you're paying more money than ever, relative even to inflation, and you're being robbed of the key part of an education, which is being challenged and having to stand there and, feel uncomfortable at best, and feel truly kind of, potentially quite damaged by the things that you hear at worst. That is important. It's very, very frustrating seeing how students are patronised all the time. It's an insult to their not inconsiderable intelligence in a lot of cases. And it's also, in my opinion, one of the biggest things that you're paying for, to be in a room full of people, who are supposedly your intellectual equals, and respecting the fact that you can change each other. You don't want to have a conversation with each other to walk away feeling happy and in agreement and accordance. You want to walk away thinking, feeling changed, and hopefully feeling challenged. I've got plenty of examples of the kind of thing that Bristol are doing that is really, damaging that. And I'd say probably one of them is surrounding the Bristol Student Union. Quite famously recently, their own feminist society, Women Talk Back, was disciplined, and the president was forced to step down because they made the mistake, of excluding male-born trans women from talks about rape and sexual assault. And this is not specific to Bristol, this has happened elsewhere. And this is the kind of thing that sums up the issues at universities. The student union should promote any conversation, any debate, any society, and it's not. These societies are living in fear or just being quashed.
Thank you very much. This is not the place to patronise youth. Anyway, just in terms of students who want to feel uncomfortable, I think maybe studying Russian is quite a good choice, actually, in this day and age. In my university, probably we reported to the Prevent programme. But anyway, Jenny, what's your thoughts on the changing nature of universities?
Thanks, Austin. I want to start by saying I think, working universities is still nice work, as David Lodge put it. Academics can moan too much. And I say that because I think it's important that there is a free speech crisis in universities. Everyone knows this, right? But I also get frustrated by, sometimes I think it's kind of used as an excuse, People working in universities will go, well, I couldn't possibly say that, I couldn't do that. The self-censorship happens ahead often of what the policies and even the cultural prescriptions are. So I think we need to get those two things untangled. I also think, for students who go, and I come from a university that's quite far down the league tables, most of them get something out of it, more or less. I'm very critical, and have always been, of the idea that people should just go to university, and that kind of, the way in which this whole kind of drive to create a market amongst students who might prefer to be doing something else and get them into university and everything else has been horrible, right? That's really bad. But I'm equally uncomfortable with the sort of backlash that says, oh, it's all a waste of time, close them down, or just make students all do STEM subjects or things that are courses that are good value for money, because I think that's utterly Philistine. So I think there's a balance here. I guess, I think, what we're seeing now is like the end of a long process of chickens coming home to roost, actually. Long-running problems of the detachment of universities from their purpose in the development and transmission of knowledge through education, and the focus on instrumental concerns, whether that's skills, employability, ideological causes. There's a lot of that relates to some of things Maeve was saying. That's among staff as well as students, and often it's staff leading the way on that. The therapeutic dimension of universities, which creates this kind of, again, as Maeve was describing, that sort of sense of anything that you might do that pushes students is kind of like a danger zone. You shouldn't do that, you shouldn't do that. And that's actually really a con, because you are denying them what they're paying for, which is education and being challenged. And I think in the UK specifically, I think it's just important to recognise this. We do have a broken funding model and a broken policy model. We have a funding model that relies on getting as many students in as possible and then trying to keep them happy. That was the student as consumer narrative that has dominated higher education policy for the past 20 years or so, which, as we all know, has had an impact on the quality of the provision provided and kind of a shift away from education. But I think it's got worse. I mean, I wrote this book I did bring it along because it was relevant. I mean, this was published in 2020 based on a study that I'd done with some colleagues of changing experiences of higher education over time, both by academics, but also how members of the public thought about universities. And it was published just as the pandemic broke. So please buy it because no one else did at the time. With the pandemic, though, I mean, a lot I think Neil's right. It wasn't that, it's like everything got thrown into question. Like the very purpose of the university, let's shut them down, I mean, it was awful, right? So everything was thrown into question, but the big questions weren't really asked. And what we have now, I think, goes beyond the problems that have been long identified with marketisation and treating universities as businesses to now a really awful focus on institutional survival, where anything goes. And the plan now by the OFS, Universities UK, everybody's buying into it, is to broker some kind of deal where they try and get 70% of young people into university. And in return, universities have said they will restructure, and raise tuition fees as well, by the way, so they'll give students less education for more money. And, and this, I think, shows how craven the whole thing has become. So it's kind of like, who's to blame? Everybody, although no one particularly. I think it's important not to just point the finger at one agent in this process, because I think it's been going on a very long time.
I think when everyone's to blame, no one's to blame, is it? That's the problem. So there's two things you've raised, which I think go across what other people have said. One is you seem to be selling a reformist agenda here, right? That, as Noel was saying, universities are marvellous places, and you're saying let's not tar everybody with the same brush, that actually they can be reclaimed. Yes, no, there are certain things going wrong that we need to address. So the question is what is it? How do you put it right? What is it that's wrong? How do you put it right? So is there something along those lines? And the second question is that we've concentrated a little bit on the student voice, as we are bound to call it. For the second aspect of universities, obviously, is like things like what lecturers do, the research agendas, which I read out, tend to be advocacy research these days, right? That you're basically there to fill funding shortfalls, or you're there to, put the university in a top tier in the Research Excellence Framework program. So suddenly research stops being research in some respects. You're fulfilling a narrative. So that's kind of a rhetorical question, if you like. But anybody want to pick up on that or what anyone else has said? Myth. Yeah.
It's difficult necessarily for me to comment on, I suppose, the financial side of things at university, because I'd sound a bit, I'm still within it, and I recognise that because I'm still a university student, and that's a big part of my identity that, regardless of the negative points we are making, I am proud of, especially to be one in this country. I think it's important. I do sometimes struggle to not sound really doom and gloom when I discuss the financial side of things in terms of, we're paying more so than students ever have before. But one thing that I do think is important, because it's still in very recent memory for me, is how schools and sixth form colleges interact with university, because I think there's something really systemically wrong there. You can make yourself quite unpopular as a student by saying, basically, I don't think everybody should go to university, because everybody hears through that. They hear, they're obviously dying to be offended, and they hear, oh, what, so you think some people are stupid? Or, oh, what, so you think some people shouldn't have access to it? That's obviously not the point that I'm making. If anything, I think a lot of students, I hesitate to say they're too clever for university, but they're clever in a very different type of way. And I'm not just talking about like, oh, he's going to go and be a carpenter. I don't necessarily mean practical knowledge. It's a different gravy. Like, the way that schools sell university to students is by saying like, oh, you're intelligent, or even something as simple as, oh, you read extensively, you should go to university. And I think it's a shame that there isn't far more direct education and informing as a process in schools and sixth forms that tells you about what university actually entails. Like the vast majority of 17 and 18 year olds, because that is the age at which you apply, 17 years old, you don't really understand anything about, for example, how to conduct yourself in a lecture, how many hours a dissertation would necessarily take you. And I think a big part of the issue with that is the fact that universities don't, quote, advertise themselves especially well online. You can go to open days and all of this, but I don't think that there's enough openness about, for example, it's so difficult to find out a syllabus, a university's course syllabus online. I think universities should have, for example, like lecture video examples, just like snippets of them, so a student could understand the kind of world that they'd be going into and the kind of things required of them. On top of that, I think that if that the other angle is that when it comes to what you actually study, you should be far more encouraged to really self-assess and work out where your active interests are academically, because I see so many people who potentially should be at university, but by God, are they in the wrong degree? And that is not necessarily their fault. It's schools. They have a real role to play here, and we're not doing it. There's this huge rift between school and uni. Students cannot bridge it themselves.
Right. School sessions next door. But anyway, the question, could we had a conversation outside, right? Which was basically, you're studying Russian and whatever it was, yeah? Some other language by a much lesser country than ours. But a little joke, mate. But anyway, but the idea is, why do you need to do that in university? Do you need? Yeah, no. It's kind of like, why does one? I mean, you can tell me why you do it, but tell me why it's required.
Languages, first of all, as I was saying to you outside, it's interesting because, I could be speaking right now in Russian and you would all believe me to be qualified to speak in Russian, because that's, the way language works. If you don't know a word, you don't know a word. So just by using it, you qualify yourself in it. And that's interesting. But I think for a lot of people, especially of languages, they go to university to enrich themselves surrounding the culture that language comes from, because they recognise that it's important not just to wield the practical skill of language, but to be educated on basically what it entails to be from that country, a native user of that language. There are so many elements of a country's history and culture that, in my opinion, are really integral if you want to be able to use that language and be and sort of gain respect from that. I think to be able to speak a language is one thing, but yeah, I'm actively interested, as I believe in my course mates. You have to sort of be humble in the face of something that is clearly far bigger than you, especially in the case of Russian, I might add. There's so much less to gain from just having a language as a practical skill in the face of the huge literary output, the huge historical relevance of it, and obviously the ongoing situation. You'd be foolish to not want to be a student of that, and to recognise that student status actually never goes away in your life if you play it well.
Good. It's broader than just a language itself, per se. Very good. Anybody, you want to scribble some notes? Do you want to come back on it?
I think that's a really good way of describing the importance of languages, and you can apply that to all kinds of education as well. And I think this is part of the problem, that is this whole nonsense has gone on. The core educational component, the context that students are taught at university is kind of diminished, and it all gets presented as a skill, in which case you say, yeah, well, why do a degree in English literature? Why not just read books? Or why not just go and live in France? And, it completely misses the point of a higher education. I just wanted to say, though, I don't think I am promoting a reformist agenda anymore. I was when I finished writing this book, because I think we concluded it by saying, on balance, there's a lot of problems. What we need to do is bring knowledge back into what universities are for and everything else. I think it's flipped over. Certainly in the UK, where I think the combination of these kind of cultural, economic, social policy pressures, and the big problem I think now is that we have such a centralised system that diversity in all its forms has gone, right? So we have no diversity of funding, which means that we don't have any institutional diversity. So universities are leaping to all provide the same courses, whatever this year's growth in student numbers is. I think what we need to do, well, not we, but policymakers, I think policymakers need to go back to something like the Robbins Report of 1963, which was a proper, thoroughgoing attempt to work out what was the need for higher education, the purpose for it in basically in post-war society. And there was an attempt to do that in the late 90s with the Deering Report, which, I prefer Robbins's conclusions to Deering, but at least there was an attempt to do that. But I think what's happening now is there's this idea that in universities that we can just carry on as we were, carry on this broken system. And I just think there's too much wrong with it. So we need more independent universities. We need to stop pushing students to go, and we need to be more selective, on the students that are admitted. What courses do we want? What are we going to, what are we doing it for? That question, what are universities for, I think is more pertinent than ever.
Yeah, very good. Neil, go for it.
So we're not supposed to agree on everything here, so I'm going to try and disagree. Just a touch. I may not be in disagreement, actually, because it may be about words rather than... But should universities come back and focus on knowledge? I mean, clearly something to do with the pursuit of truth or wisdom has to be at the core of their mission. But I spent the last 6 months in Edinburgh University while I was still employed there, doing a kind of across the whole university a project on curiosity and how you stoke it and how you combine it with open-mindedness and with sociable forms of learning, how you make learning fun, all that kind of stuff. So it was very kind of appreciative and aspirational action research, if you like. And I definitely, as part of that work, I came across a really interesting distinction that I hadn't come across before, to my knowledge, which is between what's called D-type curiosity and I-type curiosity. I don't want to get too technical here, but D-type is about didactic education, and which is about education as having the function of fulfilling gaps in knowledge, which I think, for example, has by and large been the function of schools and of schooling in general. But I don't think has to be the core purpose of universities. The second type of curiosity and associated with that second type of learning is called I-type learning, which is about interaction, interactive, inquisitive learning, where the point of a learning system is to stoke the imagination and to help people, and this is where the core of my project came in, help people not just become individually curious, but become curious in intelligent ways together with other people. The term I used was sociably curious. So, and the ability to not just be curious in well-directed ways, but to be the ability to share your curiosity with other people, listen to theirs, and then together in networks, groups, pairs, whatever, together become more socially intelligent. And that seems to me to be a more helpful and more aspirational focus than just plugging gaps in knowledge.
Good. I mean, obviously there's that kind of old parody of old Victorian educators pouring knowledge into stupid children, right? And that's seen as elitist. Whereas now we have this conversation where we all learn together in some hippy-dippy kind of idea where, actually the knowledge of the students can actually enhance my own personal experience. There may be merits to both of those, I'm sure, but we can talk about that if you want to, but I just I wanted that to float out there maybe for a conversation. I also wanted to talk about the idea of universities actually now searching for students. I think you raised it, where, like, for example, in my university, we don't have many Chinese students, which obviously is the golden goose for many universities, maybe less long-term than people suspect. Actually, in Kingston, we have the highest proportion of North Korean escapees in any outside South Korea, with not much money involved for them, I'm afraid. They're not going to pay the bills, right? So North Koreans. But then you think, we're searching for Indians, but wealthy Indians, and then you realize that there's not enough of them. Then you look for Americans, because at least Americans can come to this country and they'll pay less for their degree than they would in an American university. Everything's about chasing the dollar, right? And suddenly you lose track about what the hell it is you're doing. Don't offend anybody. Don't tell them off. Don't fail them, for God's sake. Otherwise, they ain't coming back. So once you start this kind of monetarist agenda, it suddenly transforms what it is that universities are doing. And I think that's a little, even though I agree, maybe you may not know the ins and outs of it, I certainly don't either, but I think that there's a problem for students as well as for the institution itself. Anybody got any thoughts on that, or you can go back to what we talked about? Sorry, go from here.
I was just going to briefly say, I absolutely agree with that. In fact, Bristol has a really, really high proportion. Well, I mean, you got to be careful because they call them international students. The irony being that, as a student of languages, I've studied abroad and I've also been to school abroad, both really important and amazing experiences. And the key word for me, as soon as I, leave the United Kingdom, is integrate. And I'll tell you that these students don't do that, and they don't want to. And the university is partly at fault, but it's also the students themselves. I mean, they don't see any benefit to integrating with the city itself, which especially in somewhere like Bristol is a real shame, because there's surprisingly quite a lot of harmony and integration between Bristolians, who are very proud people, and as they should be, with the students, as opposed to somewhere like Durham, where there's a very, very fractious relationship with the student population and the locals. But international students, they're a whole different sort of sector of university life, and one that's so strangely unassailable. You can't complain about the fact that, many of my friends who study engineering degrees, they'll be put on group projects with these students, and they simply don't have a level of English that allows them to work with Brits that are doing degrees and have come from elsewhere in the UK to come to Bristol. And it's a really big shame, and it's disappointing, and it damages the fabric of university life, because you've got these students that obviously make up a huge part of the student population but they're not necessarily contributing in a way that, adds more vibrancy to student life. And that's a real shame, in my opinion. It's something I've really experienced.
Okay, good.
Yeah, I mean, there's good reasons to get international students and bad ones, and the push at the moment is so explicit now, is on all the bad ones. It's like, well, at least they come with the money. But the thing is, at least they do come with money. I mean, what's been going on for a long time has been this sort of basically marketing university to students who have to go into debt to pay for an experience that then, is often below par, and that often gets written off anyway at the end of it, because of the threshold by which they pay it back. So it's like, it's bizarre. I mean, that's sort of like a fake money kind of system. And so, I think it's not just about the international students, it's about that. I just wanted to argue with Neil for a bit. It's just knowledge. I think curiosity comes from knowledge. I mean, and this was the Robbins idea of this, at the time, expanded higher education system, which was 1 in 18 students, right, rather than 1 in 2, where, that was the point, that, we had these places and students should live away from home, because then they will be with academic communities, and the discussions would happen not just in their lectures, but on campuses, and there was discussion about grants versus loans, and it was decided to give students grants because otherwise it would, make the wrong, basically force families to make the wrong kind of calculations. What they wanted were people who could be at university. I mean, it was about the creation of a meritocratic elite, which, whatever the problems with the concept of meritocracy, it had a very kind of clear logic with it. And it was about, academics were supposed to do research and teaching, because what we know and what we're generating then becomes the basis for intellectual curiosity amongst students. And this is what I find so, difficult at the moment now, where the idea of like knowledge is seen in this very kind of passive way, as though, that's all, very old school. And then yet we're supposed to be teaching students what academic skills, critical thinking skills, employability skills. They've all got jobs, for Christ's sake. I mean, they've probably worked longer hours than a lot of academics, but I didn't say that.
Danny, calm down. Right.
But,
Do you see what I mean? Yeah, Neil, come back on that.
So I've nothing against making knowledge one of the central purposes, and I agree that knowledge and curiosity interact. I don't think curiosity just comes from knowledge. Also, obviously, you go and pursue knowledge if you get curious. And we how do we become curious? Well, curiosity is infectious. It's a social. It passes through social networks and through relationships. So I think we clearly have to have both. Regarding skills, well, actually, maybe even regarding knowledge too, I think we need to ask the question, just supposing you want to assess whether universities are doing this cost efficiently, providing this knowledge cost efficiently, you need to ask the what if question, the counterfactual question. What if universities didn't exist? How would people acquire this knowledge? How would people acquire those skills? And the answer in just about every case would have to be, you can certainly, if you want knowledge, you can get that much cheaper than by going to university. If you want particular skills, go to the workplace, get an apprenticeship. It's far, far cheaper and more cost efficient to do that. So if university has value, it has to be something to do with, that takes us back to the name university, which is, a community of scholars doing a multitude of different things, combining the pursuit of knowledge with sitting apart from society for a while, doing research, etc. So the goods that might come from university don't come from any one good, such as the acquisition of skills and knowledge. They come from the supposed benefits of the institution. So we have to examine the institution, and if it's not looking how we want it to be, then we reform that.
Okay, I mean, I think we're getting somewhere at it. I teach architecture, so I'm looking at it from a kind of a political reality perspective. There's what we would like it to be and what it actually is. There's this thing which in architecture is called thinking through design. Okay, I always was a great believer in design through thinking. Call me old-fashioned, but I think you have to think about something first before you can design it. But actually now you can get a PhD by building a house, right? If you're an architect and you design a house, You can just talk about it and write 1,000 words, 10,000 words, and you get a PhD. So, the world's gone bloody bonkers. And a PhD is now the equivalent of a master's. A master's is the equivalent of an O-level. And the great inflation and what have you is something we haven't talked about. But I'm very mindful of the fact I have to go out to these ladies and gentlemen who've been waiting very patiently.
Bum, bum, bum.